Good evening, everybody. My name's Toby Simpson, and I'm the director of the Wiener Holocaust Library. And we're delighted to be hosting tonight's book talk about the new Antisemitism by Shalom Lappin in conversation with David Hirsh. And this is an event in collaboration with the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. I'll say something about the Centre and David Hirsh. David will introduce Shalom. But before I do that, I just have a couple of housekeeping points to make. The first thing to say is that, of course, we're delighted to welcome you all here in person, but we are also welcoming people online. This is a hybrid event, and we're delighted about that. So when we have the sort of question session, we will be taking questions from the room, but we'll also be taking questions from home. So I would encourage people at home to type their questions into the chat. The other thing to say for the people in the room is that there isn't a planned fire alarm. In the highly unlikely event that a fire alarm does go off, a colleague of mine will be donning a high-vis jacket, and the doors where you came into the building are the same doors that you have to leave. But please don't go off home. We will need to check that everyone has left the building safely. The toilets are at the back of the building in the basement. There is an exit, however, also on the basement floor via the stairwell, so don't ascend the stairs, just leave the building to the back if you are downstairs in the basement. Okay, I think that's the housekeeping done. First thing to say is that this cooperation between the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism and the Wiener Holocaust Library means a lot to us, because the library has been associated with the struggle against antisemitism since its founding. For those of you who aren't aware, the library is the world's oldest archive about the Holocaust, and it was founded by a man called Dr. Alfred Wiener, who was one of the very earliest to recognize the threat posed by the Nazis, not only to Jews, but also to Germany, to Europe, the world. And he began very early on warning people about that. And in fact, he didn't stop doing that throughout the war, where he amassed the first serious archive of material about National Socialism and the Holocaust. After the war, following contributing to the Nuremberg trials, he continued to monitor anti-Semitism right up until the 1960s, and he was running the library. It was his life's work, and he was continuing to do that right until the end of his life. So this has always been part of the library's work, and the partnerships that we do with centres like the London Centre, which does brilliant work analysing the phenomenon of contemporary anti-Semitism and has multiple publications as well. So we will be hearing from the director, David Hirsh, and this is his excellent book on contemporary left anti-Semitism, but there are several publications from the centre as well, which we have here today on sale, and I believe they're also on sale online if you're joining us from home. So please do check those out after the talk. The library also did an important exhibition on the struggle to fight anti-Semitism, which we have a catalogue of on our online shop and here on sale. There's also an online exhibition which you can visit via our website, so please do take a look at that. Okay, so I will begin by introducing David Hirsh, who will be in conversation with Shalom Lappin about the new anti-Semitism. So David Hirsh is a senior lecturer in sociology at Goldsmiths University of London. He has won for his sociological work, among other honours, the British Sociological Association Philip Abrams Memorial Prize for his first book, which I just showed you, and since then has been not only writing extensively about the subject of anti-Semitism, but also tirelessly campaigning to challenge anti-Semitism in public life. And we're delighted to have him here today to introduce Shalom Lappin and to be in conversation with him. So over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Toby, and to absolutely underline what a pleasure, a joy, how really pleased we are to be working with the Wiener Library and holding joint events. Very important to us. In the present times, I mean, sometimes I'm hearing people saying, you know, Holocaust education hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. We put all the money into it, it hasn't worked, we shouldn't do it. And of course, the answer is always, we should do it, and we should do it better. And we should do it right, and I think the Wiener Library is a place that does it right, and a place that is, in that specific context, very important. So very, very pleased with that. I need my glasses on because to introduce Shalom Lappin is professor of all sorts of clever things that I never really quite understood. Professor of Natural Language Processing at Queen Mary, Emeritus Professor of Computational Linguistics at King's, a research scientist at the Centre for Linguistic Theory and Studies in Probability at the University of Gothenburg. We can talk about that a little. I remember meeting Shalom, it is 20 years ago now, when the campaign to boycott Israeli academia arose in the academic unions. It was a campaign, and still is a campaign, about what happens here, I think just as much, if not more, than what happens over there in Israel. It is about excluding Israelis from our campuses, from this building, from where I work, from where we work. My memory of that is that a few of us rocked up and kind of felt young and confident and said, we're going to do this properly now. And I suspect we were quite rude, and we kind of did our best, but I have a much clearer understanding of what people had been dealing with for years before we, decided to fix it. We didn't fix it. Shalom, I wanted to talk to you about the context, the political context, really, of what I would probably call populism, and we can discuss if that's the right word. We've seen the election results this weekend. I kind of forgot about the European Union, and I didn't really know that the elections were going on there, but they were, and the far right, maybe not the far right, but the right-wing populist parties did very well in France, in Germany, in other places. I have just come back from the US, and it strikes me that Donald Trump is very strong, and the election is coming up in November. And there's a bit of a lull in Britain after the populist movements around Brexit and around Corbyn. So I want to ask you first about that. Is it a useful term, and does it describe something that is present and similar in left populism and also right populism?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question. Please permit me a brief prologue where I, first of all, thank you above all and the center, but also the Wiener Library for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. And it's an unusual experience. I'm used to writing books that are inaccessible to most people, have 3 readers, 2 of whom say that I'm completely wrong, and 1 who says they came up with the idea before, and then there's a 4th person who said they didn't buy the book because it was too expensive. So this is not a usual experience. David, we actually know each other for 25 years. We were together in the struggle against the boycott, and we were together in the early years of the Euston Manifesto. I wish to salute the work that you've done in the center and in fighting anti-Semitism and being an activist all these years. You've shown much more energy than I've able to manage when I, although a young activist at the beginning, decided to retreat to the study until I decided it was necessary to write this book. Again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss some of the ideas in the book. Concerning populism, I consciously avoided using the term in the book. You may have noticed. It's got a weird history. So the populist movement in America was generally associated with a movement that had left-wing and right-wing elements combined, and that was also the case in Argentina. The populist movement around Peronism had left and right. These were generally movements where the populism consisted of a fair amount of demagoguery. I would prefer, in describing the right-wing or far-right groups that you mentioned, and the term that I use in the book is ethnocentric right. It's a right that's extremely nationalist, that its right-wing attitudes are not defined necessarily by its economic policies, and there can be even incompatibilities on that, say, between Trumpian libertarians and welfare fascists in Europe. So I have avoided the term populism, although people can define it in a way that might be useful. And I think you're right to point to the rise of the far right as something of considerable significance. I spend a lot of time on discussing it in the book because I think that actually, although increasing numbers of people who are in the Jewish community and feel under attack might be tempted to see it as an appropriate response to the far left, what I call the postmodernist or in quotes, anti-colonialist left and the radical Islamist coalition. The far right is, in fact, in many ways, electorally much more of a threat to us. Whereas the coalition that is trying to run us out of the universities and out of the streets now, as well as all sorts of domains of culture, which is a threat, stands very little chance of electoral power in the West. Certainly in Europe, etc., and certainly in America. But its behavior, the sight of young people in kafiyot covering their faces, marching through the streets of London, Paris, and New York, and Toronto, my own hometown, on a near weekly or daily basis, is actually managing to upset a lot of people, not only Jews. And the non-Jews who are upset generally are not the ones who are heard, who make themselves known in a way that's clear, but I think electorally they're expressing their attitudes. And they're moving very much to the far right because they see the far right as a way of countering what they regard as a threatening tendency of extremism on the other side. Unfortunately, the far right doesn't provide the solution. It's also extremely dangerous to us because it deals in this sort of replacement myths and purity myths of culture that have been lethal to Jews in the past. So the point of the book, actually, if it can be summarized very briefly, is that we find ourselves in a kind of rather unique situation caught between three extremist movements, an ethnocentric far right, a postmodernist, non-class-based far left, and a radical Islamist movement which has become extremely powerful in the West as well as in the Middle East and other parts of the world, Africa as well, and Asia. And the far left and the Islamists are operating in coalition, and this is not simply, from what I see, an arrangement of convenience. I think there are roots for that which go back at least to the 60s, which we can talk about later. What's common to all of them is I would see a strong anti-globalist reaction, an anti-elitist response, and a view that the economic and social goods of the societies they live in are manipulated by a global elite and that they have no control. And of course, in that sort of environment where conspiracy theories flourish, particularly in the wake of a pandemic and a recession, Jews are the go-to natural defendant. And there are deep cultural reasons for that, which I try and trace. So I would try and break the term populism down into its various constituencies here rather than use it as a cover term.
So, but there are specific senses in which you think that the three, actually, the left, the right, and the Islamist movements have similarities?
Yes, definitely. I think that, and I try to bring out the commonalities, which is the anti-globalism, the politics of grievance, and the severe identity-based politics, where the role of identity kind of works differently in each case, but plays a sort of turbocharging engine of outrage in each of these movements. So in the far right, you get the usual idea of a nativist reaction where we are under attack from immigrants and foreigners, with often Jews treated as the original version of this in the 19th century in Europe was that Jews were going to replace us. And you saw that even said in the demonstration in Charlottesville in South Carolina. Jews will not replace the torchlit parade by the neo-Nazis. Now the more common version is second-order replacement, where the Jews are orchestrating the immigrations that'll replace us, and that's what produced the shooting in the Tree of Life. The person was convinced that HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, was deliberately importing large numbers of immigrants to undermine white Christian society. In the far left, you have a different kind of identity politics. It's postmodern. A class has now been more or less shunted aside as a significant factor in revolution. And it's gender, race, and ethnicity are the same ingredients which drive right-wing populism, but inverted. It's the people who are regarded as on the receiving end of white colonialism. Apparently other kinds of colonialism are not a problem. They come in different colors, but it's only the white ones from Europe. But it is very much identity-driven, and one's place in the order of virtue is determined by one's ethnic identity rather than by one's class or one's political views. And Islamism is an attempt to reclaim the glory of a fictitious early age of Islam, not, by the way, the high science and art period of Islamic culture, the glory of Islamic culture in the Middle Ages, but a mythic early primitive period, just following Muhammad. This is what is regarded as a sort of Spartan ideal of Sharia law, and similarly identity-driven, motivated by the idea that Islamic countries have been ruined by Western cultural influences, liberalism and being one of the main ones. And of course, Jews, again, have been imported as the primary merchants of corruption here. And this goes back, actually, to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, where Jews were picked out by early Islamist writers as the source of the destruction of the caliphate at the beginning of the 20th century, which was the fall of the Ottoman Empire. So yeah, identity politics is driving it. It's anti-globalist. And I think it's reacting to certain kinds of economic as well as social dislocations, which we've seen at least since 1980, and which have, at this point, have brought on us a crisis of very deep proportions. We're ripping apart the liberal democratic post-war order in the West, as well as other kinds of cohesions in other societies.
There's so much there. I want to talk about the anti-global idea. I also want to talk about the idea of grievance, politics of grievance. But I just want to stick for a moment with identity, because I was trying to find a way to ask you to say, surely most of the contemporary right-wing, what I have called populists, there's a sense in which they're not ethno-nationalist, or at least then I was thinking how to ask that question, and then I thought, well, there is a kind of huge and angry response to the suggestion, you know, how very dare you say that we are racists, right? The kind of classically the Trumpist response or the Brexit response, how dare you call us racist? In fact, how dare you call us ethno-nationalists? Mm-hmm. And it's that how very dare you, I think, is very interesting, because of course we see that mirrored in left anti-Semitism, where it is how very dare you accuse me of anti-Semitism. And there's even kind of mixed in with that, there's a sense in which racism or xenophobia somehow is thought to be a kind of natural response to the bad things that happen in our day. It's a kind of authentic response, and it's the elite liberals who are against your racism and who call it racism who are the real enemy. And similarly with anti-Semitism, it's there is a phenomenon that is the authentic kind of angry response of people to Zionism and colonialism, And it's the really bad people are the kind of liberals who use this language to call it anti-Semitism and therefore to kind of prohibit it. So lots of odd reversals and similarities, but well, there's plenty there, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you've put your finger on something quite important, which is, I mean, there are, of course, elements in both camps which will happily admit to being not necessarily racist, but nativist in a certain way. So the far right, I mean, perhaps will talk about defending European Christian values, certainly in America. That is they might not say white, well, although a certain segment will say white. Trump is at pains, I think, to bring in decorative representatives of other groups, but, and also to attract voters from these groups for pragmatic reasons, whether they be African Americans or Jews or Hispanics. And on the far left, the extent to which ethnicity, gender identity, or gender marginality, as well as a variety of other traits are seen now in an inverted way as marks of virtue, inherited virtue, virtually. So whereas we had always thought that a progressive egalitarian approach was to judge people according to their views, their actions, their achievements, we are now basically, in both cases, looking at them from where they come from, who they are ethnically. And of course, in Islamism, we have a similar view, except it tends to be more binary. You're either, and by the way, it's important to recognize that the radical Islamists, their main target before they hit the West are other Islamic countries where the regimes are not regarded as properly Islamic. The hatred for these regimes and for the people who support them equals that attaches to Israel and Jews. But again, those people who are not part of what is regarded as the Islamist revolution are really treated as subhuman. And then, so this is very much an identity, in this case, a very traditional religious identity-driven politics of outrage. And there's very little you can do to argue rationally in this kind of a context. I mean, what kind of, so that the ethnocentric nativist right does this, well, they've always done it. That radical Islamists did it, that's been the tradition for at least 150 years. That the left has now embarked on this is quite remarkable, because the left was always presenting itself as the inheritors of the Enlightenment. And now they have declared the Enlightenment to be, in fact, the source of white European colonialism. And this was a kind of radical extension of Gramsci's critical deconstruction of knowledge as an edifice built on bourgeois oppression, except whereas Gramsci was still working within a Marxist class-based analysis, the postmodernist left is just gone straight over to an inversion of the ethnocentric right, where the very Christian European values that the ethnocentric right seeks to preserve, they see as the source of all oppression. There apparently were no empires before Europe. There were no slavery or empire outside of Europe, and if it was committed by other such empires, whether it be the Ottoman one or the Mongol or whatever, or even in Latin America, Aztec and Incan, that's considered to be acceptable because one doesn't judge other cultures which are non-Western. That would be considered colonialist. So the left is basically that part of the left, and it's a large part we encountered in the universities, fortunately not in my department yet, but in the humanities and the social sciences. You can't do a whole lot of computer science with that kind of a theory. But certainly in humanities and social sciences, these ideas have become de rigueur in many so-called prestigious institutions. As Bill Mayer says, don't call them prestigious, just call them expensive. Now, in this kind of a context, rational discussion becomes impossible.
So interesting, actually, to hook onto the idea of the irrationality of the claims and the irrationality of the discourse. I mean, Trump loves being irrational, right? He glories in it. People love him for his irrationality, and perhaps that's also something in common, is that the left that you're talking about has a thorough critique of rationality, and in fact believes that rationality and the other Enlightenment values are themselves really the root of all oppression. I could say the root of all evil, because oppression is the most evil thing in our time. And if you like, that's one of the big divides in the university, is the claim that, well, that some people embrace the values of the Enlightenment, and Marx, for example, said that there are all these things that get in the way of us realizing the values of the Enlightenment. And Marx is for completing the Enlightenment, but the other position says that the Enlightenment is the reinstigation of the old power and oppression and injustice, but in a new and extra efficient modern form, rational form. So it's a very kind of harsh distinction, and certainly in my institution and in my discipline, it's very usual to have that kind of view of the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment itself was the beginning, really, of oppression and of sexism and of imperialism and all of those other things. So the irrationality of the discourse is a kind of, becomes a theory in defense of at least a critique of the rational.
Yes, I think that's right. But it's interesting that oppression and colonial oppression is considered evil only when committed by certain agencies. So, for example, the slave trade carried on by non-Western peoples, and it was substantial. I mean, you had huge slave trades in the Arab world that ran through East Africa before the American before the European slave trade. There were the oppression of women, the use of rape, etc., as a tool of warfare, was absolutely rife in the Mongol Empire. And on and on and on. These are considered somehow irrelevant. They're not within the terms of discussion.
So the picture of the world is one in which, before the Enlightenment, I mean, there are lots of lovely fantasies about everybody living a lovely life and in loving everybody else. But also there are all sorts of kind of, the kinds of things that you've just been describing. But the idea is that at some point in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, at some point there was the reinstitution of all the horror and the destruction of all the nice, authentic community in a kind of modern, rational, organized way. And that's why they are so fixated on that particular kind of imperialism, and that particular kind of slavery, because for them it just it recreates the whole world as a single iron cage.
Yeah, but then we come back to Jews. Because who runs all of this? Well, even though our general role has been that of a non-Western people or a non-European people wandering through Europe as well as the Middle East and other parts of the world, the idea here is that, in fact, Jews are, at best, representatives of white privilege. And the non-white Jews, who are numerous and probably a majority or a plurality in Israel, were dupes of the white Jews. So all of the categories we use to understand ourselves, which are run orthogonal to those, are inverted, and we are now put in the position of the impresarios of colonial oppression. And so you have things like Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam publishing a book on the relationship between blacks and Jews, which is an attempt to hold Jews as, or portray them as the essential mercenaries of the slave trade. This was debunked by serious scholars who studied the slave trade and said, well, yeah, there were Jewish slave owners, of course there were, but their percentage was small, and in fact, in proportional terms, when you weight proportion, it was less than that of other ethnic groups. This has no impact on the discussion. But behind this is the idea that Jews are essentially the representatives of privilege. Now, this comes from really deep sources. This is not, I mean, you could trace it all the way back to the connection between Jews and capitalism, which itself comes from what I would call an eschatological view, or a role assigned to Jews in history, in Europe, and then inherited in parts of the Middle East, which is that Jews are really the factor which prevents the emergence of a utopia. That the utopia that we strive for, in which there's no war, in which there is an equitable distribution of resources, and in which we some mythic past or phantasmagorical future is achieved, we are the main obstacles to this. And this has very deep religious roots.
So when the Jews rejected or murdered Jesus, it didn't only screw them, it screwed everybody, right?
Yes, yes. Yes, indeed. It prevented the creation of a Christian utopia. And this idea seeped into secular ideas, and you can see it both in right-wing and in left-wing movements, which in the 19th century turned it into secular anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism as a political movement didn't exist until the 19th century, and it became a racialized movement, where the source of the evil wasn't religious belief, but actually was a kind of quasi or pseudo-racial notion, that we were genetically programmed to behave this way. And out of that grew Nazism, but actually there are strong roots for that on the left. So early socialists, like anarcho-syndicalists, like Joseph Proudhon and Bakunin, held views on Jewish capitalism, which are not distinct from those of von Schoner and other proto-Nazis of the late 19th century. And the language they used was really quite similar. And these both groups trace their history to the failure of the 1848 revolution that swept Europe, and there were strong economic reasons, of dislocations and crises that produced this. And I'm seeing, and try to argue in the book, that I see similar patterns emerging with important differences in the post-war period. And perhaps I can insert something here. I've been talking about the extremes. What's frightening about what we see going on now is not simply the loss of rationality and the tend towards extremism. What we see are the guardians of the public domain in liberal societies essentially stepping aside and watching the rise of extreme, focused anti-Semitism in our streets, and treating it as either an administrative problem, which is to be handled by negotiations with students who are essentially engaging in criminal behavior, or to be handled by free speech arguments, when what's being promoted as free speech is racist abuse. There is no serious reaction. And this comes from what I think is a structural problem here, which is that throughout our history, we have never been a constituency that has enjoyed support for the notion of emancipation or liberation. There's never been a movement that has allied itself with the cause of Jewish liberation. It's always been, at best, and this is only part of the left, seen dealing with anti-Semitism as a kind of side effect, something that will disappear when the revolution triumphs. And this is also true of liberalism, and the roots of liberalism. There has never been a movement that has taken upon itself the role of supporting Jewish emancipation as a cause, as opposed to, say, the emancipation of women, the emancipation of workers, the emancipation of black people, which were compelling and just causes, of course. We never occupied that sort of a role, not in Europe and not in the Middle East, where we constituted numbers, and certainly never in America, when immigration was cut off to bring us here. And that's an important point, I think, that people fail to realize. When Jews then created their own liberation movements, whether they be Jewish socialist movements like the Bund, which were anti-Zionist, or Zionist movements, they were accused of particularism, right? Because to take anti-Semitism, and this is a point you brought out in your writing, to take anti-Semitism seriously is regarded as provincialism and chauvinism. And that now is front and center of the reaction that we're seeing on the campuses and in various other places. And unfortunately, there are small minorities of Jews who are happy to participate in that, in my view, thoroughly perverse view.
Gosh, I mean, we could go in every direction from many moments, but actually I'm interested in that right now for the moment, the idea that there are Jews who are part of the movement, a part of the politics, part of the intellectual framework of anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier, interestingly, there are other minorities who you said are part of the, basically, who tag themselves onto ethno-nationalist right-wing movements. It's really interesting, that kind of assertion of belonging, right? Mm-hmm. We are Jewish, but we belong. We are African Americans, but we belong in America, and we're not like these other guys. Can you explain that? I mean, it seems a complete mystery to people how you can have racist African Americans or anti-Semitic Jews. It seems like mad to people who haven't really thought about it. But those of us who have been in this world like come across it all the time. So how do you explain it?
In the case of African Americans and Hispanics and Asians who support Trump or counterparts of far-right ethnocentric groups in Europe, it's very hard for me to parse what's going on there. I suspect there is a certain amount of irrational politics of resentment on their part, that they feel hard done by mainstream parties, taken for granted by, say, Democrats in America.
It's a kind of assertion of belonging, isn't
Yes.
it? That we are Americans, and we are Americans, and the Trump movement is not racist. How very dare you? We are Americans, and these are our values, and we're part of it. And so perhaps in the same way that you have anti-Zionist Jews also saying, these are the values of the left, these are the values of the university, and we are part of it, and we assert our right to remain part of it.
Well, I would see that as true of far-right conservatives like Supreme Court Justice Thomas. Clarence Thomas certainly represents an attitude of that sort. I made it on my own, I did it, why can't you, etc. I suspect that a lot of African American support, however, I mean, there is, of course, the case of Kanye West, which seems to be more a mental health issue.
And we denounce Israeli genocide, why can't you?
Yes, no.
I mean, am I making is there not a similarity?
The Jews, I think something else is going on. But let me just finish with the African Americans. I think with the African Americans and maybe with Hispanics, there's a sense of stop taking us for granted, stop treating us as an underclass. We aren't, the Democrats have never delivered. They've always taken us for granted, always promised, and there's a certain percentage of the population that says enough, we'll vote the other way. I'm not clear to me that they're really deep right-wing ethno-nationalists. It seems to me that they're asserting a certain dissatisfaction with mainstream parties. With the case of Jews, I think it's a totally different phenomenon. I think with Jews, there's a very long tradition of this thing that goes back in our history a real long way of currying favor with sources of power and making sure that it's not nice to be hated. Most people don't like it. If the social circles you travel in require a certain orthodoxy, the pressures to adopt it are very strong, and you'll try and reconcile it with your identity, perhaps, often making a parody of that identity with the Pesach Seders in which you wear kafiyot and celebrate liberation according to Hamas. But this, by the way, goes back to, I think, in more immediate terms, a period when the Jews were honestly believed that the left was a messianic movement that promised liberation for them. And you had large numbers of Jews who fought with the communist revolution because the communist revolution was a Mashiach. And at the time, it was very reasonable to think that. The old order offered them nothing. The rising neo-fascist, or at the time, an old fascist order offered only danger, the left was an obvious route to breaking the shackles of marginality and oppression. It went badly. We ended up playing the same kind of role there that we were cast in before. And I give an example in the book, an interesting phenomena where there is my wife pointed this out to me, she found it and deserved credit, of an article by an American Jewish communist by the name of Harab, published in '53 as a pamphlet article by a publication called Jewish Life, which was associated with Communist Party USA. And it was a defense of the Slansky trial, which was one of Stalin's show trials, in which 9 of 14 leaders of the Czechoslovak Communist Party were accused of being agents of Zionism and cosmopolitanism and sabotaging the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. And a number of them were executed, the others were thrown in jail, and it was a show trial of the classic Stalin variety. Jewish communists flocked to this. They supported it. This guy wrote an apologetic, which, but for the use of terms capitalism and bourgeois, are identical to the kinds of justifications we're reading today for hatred of Israel by Jewish anti-Zionists. Now, Jewish Life morphed into a publication called Jewish Currents when Jewish Life split from the Communist Party in 1955, and Jewish Currents remained a kind of residue Jewish far-left magazine until it was relaunched as Jewish Currents in 1918 and 2018, and it is now the main venue for these very same anti-Zionists speaking the language of anti-colonialism. It substitutes colonialism, white privilege, white male privilege, white cis male privilege for capitalism and bourgeois. The Harab article translates directly into what was said now, what is being said now. Stop conflating Zionism and Judaism. The Western press, run and controlled by Zionists, are misrepresenting the facts, etc. There is a long tradition of this kind of thing. And what's going on now is simply a kind of change of terminology. I see the Jews as falling into that pattern. The old-timers who went along with communism had an excuse. They didn't know where it was going to lead, and by the time they did, they were the victims of Stalinism. The current generation is simply historically illiterate. They haven't bothered looking at their own history and seeing where this leads.
So you mentioned it again, and let's go back to the idea of grievance and the politics of grievance, because I think in your book there is quite an important idea, which is that underlying this kind of political instability, which is part of the reason that anti-Semitism and what you call ethno-nationalism can become so popular, underlying it is a real failure of capitalism, of the state, of our society to deliver a decent life for the majority of the people, or at least such a perceived failure. So the question really is, what was it about, in particular, the time shortly before the rise of these politics that we're talking about, the time of Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, and what was it about those times which you feel are so really implicated in what comes next?
Well, thank you. That's actually the driving hypothesis of the book, is that the crisis we're seeing now, which is an expression of very deep social and economic forces, is brought on by what I take to be the effects of globalization in this current wave. And the first chapter is devoted to actually there are charts in it, etc. Again, members of the family saw this and sort of hit their forehead and said, "Again, Dad, you're going to be a nerd. You're going to tell us." But in fact, I think it's necessary to see the economic history of what's going on here. It's not reductionist or in a Marxist account in a narrow sense by any means, but it is an attempt to provide what Alan Johnson, one of our colleagues and friends, has, I think, insightfully described as a political economy of contemporary anti-Semitism. And I think what you see in the 19th century is a huge rise in globalization under conditions of colonialism, I might add, but in the classical sense of the term, and that this brought about a very substantial rise in both within country inequality, income inequality and wealth inequality, and between country, and that within Europe, this was expressed by the peaking of the Industrial Revolution and massive social dislocation, people being forced off the land, the rise of a large working class under conditions of poverty, and that much of the collapse of the old order, which was semi-feudal and imperial, and that many of the extremist movements that wrenched the continent and produced anti-Semitism for cultural reasons, which I try and describe historically, came about in the cauldron of that kind of conflict. And it certainly reached a kind of apotheosis in the First World War, which destroyed that order, but then turned completely toxic after the First World War. And we saw what we saw. Now, the second interesting, vastly sharpened period of globalization was basically started in the late 70s, early 80s, where you have in economic terms, the breakdown of the post-war order, the Bretton Woods order, and that goes not only for the West, but also in parts of the East and Asia. You saw a conscious attempt to dismantle constraints on the movement of capital. You saw liberalization in the narrow economic sense of trade arrangements, which benefited particular groups of people and not others. And the result was massive increasing social dislocation as production moved out of Western and European countries into China and India. You saw dispossession in rural communities, devastation. I mean, it's not only in America or in Britain in the north. I mean, take a trip, as I did during a conference through the area of the Alsace, notorious for all sorts of reasons. You see burned out areas all over France of people in cafes in the middle of the day. That's still going on. The mainstream parties promoted and then became imprisoned by these kinds of patterns, so that the normal constraints that preserved social and economic cohesion, which were the welfare state, the glory, by the way, of Britain as well as America in the post-war era, as well as all sorts of constraints on what was considered normatively reasonable politically, started just to disappear as mainstream parties became effectively prisoners of that kind of an economy, having to essentially attract capital through lowering taxes and destroying the welfare state and promoting this kind of pattern. Now, I'm not of the view that globalization itself is the problem. The problem is how the arrangements that determined who would benefit from the profits that were generated. And in an environment like that, I remember saying to friends who were much more sophisticated in their understanding of the economics than I was, that this is going to produce economic chaos. This is going to produce political extremism, and the liberal order is in danger. And the reaction to that was, oh no, you don't understand how deeply entrenched the middle class is. You don't understand how stable these societies are. And in fact, unfortunately, they proved wrong. Not because they knew less, they knew more than me, but the understanding of the social effects of this kind of dislocation when they're not mitigated was simply faulty. Now, when you look at the American political map, you can see a direct correlation between rural poverty, working class workers without university education, and Trumpian sentiments. You can see the same sort of pattern in Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland. You can see it in France with the National Rally. And you can see it in Hungary, and you can see it in Turkey. with the rural classes, the people who suffered from these kinds of patterns, immediately going towards the far right, and in some cases also towards the far left Islamist pattern. And for very well-known substantive historical and cultural reasons, Jews then become the target as this kind of metaphysics, this eschatology of Jewish manipulation, surfaces as a dominant focus of resentment. We are the liberals. We are the educated class. We are the people who manipulate. We are the people who benefit, the lawyers. And in that kind of situation, we are completely exposed.
So underlying the contemporary rise of anti-Semitism and of perhaps other racisms, underlying that is a genuine set of grievances, kind of justified grievances, which become articulated in a language which will not help in the end, which will only harm, but that the sense of grievance that is manifested in anti-Semitism, you're arguing, is real.
Yes. That's not to say, I mean, the sense of grievance is real. In the same way that,
and the grievance itself is real.
Yes.
Not just the sense.
Look, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the people who committed pogroms were very often the people who they were of course encouraged by the Tsar and the Russian Empire to do so as a way of deflecting attention from the oppressive nature of that society. But they were the people who were themselves displaced economically. And interestingly enough, it was often the left, but certain components of the left, the Narodniki and even certain elements of the nascent Bolshevik left, were initially supportive of these pogroms. It's an expression of class consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay, and they were seen as a primitive form of anti-capitalism. Of course, there were somewhat more enlightened socialists who referred to this as a socialism of fools. I think we are living through the anti-colonialism of fools. That isn't to say that the forces which are producing this reaction are real forces. And the way to cope with it is not by treating anti-Semitism as a standalone phenomenon, but to treat it as an expression of a very deep social crisis, which we have to address if we're ever going to hope. And it threatens the liberal order. We are always the first act in this catastrophe. It then goes on to destroy the society that mounts it. And we've seen it before. That's in the long run. So in the latter part of the book, the last chapter is an attempt to talk about a new kind of social democracy, which would be one that addresses these issues on an international scale, because you can no longer deal with them within the confines of a nation state. However, that said, since October the 7th, things have developed much more quickly than I thought they would. We have a serious problem as Jews, which is Jewish survival. And that's always been a driving issue for us. So it's one thing to worry about saving the world. Yes, we're part of the world. We need to worry about the kinds of reforms that will make it livable. We also have to worry about the details of Jewish survival. And those are, at this point, very pressing, extremely pressing.
How long do we have? I'm aware suddenly, Toby, you stood up as though making a statement.
But it wasn't, it's not pressing, but we normally end at 8.
Right. Okay. So let me just ask maybe one or two questions. I mean, I don't know what's more frightening. The idea that underlying anti-Semitism is a kind of rational explanation, which gives you a sort of rational understanding of why the grievance, or that anti-Semitism is just completely irrational. I don't know which is more frightening, the idea that it's completely irrational or the idea that there are underlying material causes. Or perhaps another way of asking the question is to say that there is so much clear water between a sense of grievance and then blaming Zionism for your the fact that your factory was closed down 3 generations ago and your life is not as you would like it to be. There's such a kind of gulf between the grievance and the action that if the gulf is so big, then the grievance is not an explanation of the action.
No, I would agree. I'm not suggesting that anti-Semitism or any form of racism is in any way rational. In fact, it's the essence of irrationality. It's the search for magical thinking and explanations to try and control forces which seem beyond the ken of the lives of people who are affected by changes that they're frightened by, and understandably frightened. A rational approach would be to look at what it is that's causing the disruptions that are upending their lives, and to address those. That's not what's being done by demagogues and cult leaders. They are being seduced into finding cheap and easy solutions. And anti-Semitism has always been a kind of the ultimate conspiracy theory. So no, of course, I wasn't in any way trying to suggest it's rational. What I was suggesting is that its appearance filling a void in a period of chaos is, in some sense, understandable, predictable. If there's enough political chaos in a culture where anti-Semitism has a long history, it's going to surface. It's the best, most long-lived, malleable, flexible, adaptable form of racism on the planet in terms of providing easy explanations for why people are unhappy and why their social order is out of kilter and why the utopia that should exist doesn't. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to look at those causes to understand why that's happening. I would also qualify that with the fact that we are now reaching a point of extremism, of extremists, that is very, very serious threat to us, given the rapid disintegration of the normal guardrails of a liberal society.
So is it this, right? Obviously, there is a question of agency, right? The people responsible for anti-Semitism are the people who say and do anti-Semitic things and who popularize that amongst the people around them. Is perhaps your point then that those people could, in a healthy society, could say whatever they like and nobody would care and nobody would be interested, but in a society that has these underlying structural issues and then grievances, then suddenly the people who are doing the anti-Semitic things find themselves in a much stronger position?
Absolutely. I think that in a normal, cohesive, healthy, stable society where people feel secure, it's more likely, far more likely, that extreme theories, racist theories of this kind, anti-Semitism in particular, will be on the margins. That the norms that determine civilized political discourse will exclude these from the mainstream. They will not cease to exist. Treat them as pathogens. Pathogens are always present. Viruses are always there. They become extremely dangerous and cause sepsis when the body is in bad shape, when other factors have weakened one's resistance system. And I think that's what's happened, if you can use a medical analogy, is that the economic and social turmoil of the last 30, 40 years have produced a very serious weakening of the kinds of forms of normal resistance that ensure social cohesion. And that's why I'm worried. And I'm worried now in the very short term. Let me, if I can, draw a distinction. People, well-meaning perhaps, I'm less inclined to think people are well-meaning and naive these days than I did in the past, but journalists assure us that many of the students who are ripping up campuses and non-students who are marching through streets with kafiyot covering their faces and yelling what I take to be modern-day Hitlerjugend type slogans, that these are people, that these are really idealists of the form that we knew from the 60s. I was active in the anti-war movement in the 60s. I was active in the student left. I was part of all of that. I never saw anything of this sort. Okay, there were crazy, extreme, irresponsible things were done. Buildings were occupied. No one, as I recall, targeted a particular group, even when they were regarded as an enemy group. Nobody, there were anti-Zionists around then too. I was part of a left Zionist group, and I used to have weekly arguments with Trotskyists, many of whom were Jewish. We would have arguments which got heated. I would go to their headquarters and we would have parties afterwards. We remained friends. We occupied the same universe. The arguments they gave were not anti-Jewish arguments. They were naive arguments about class, about what's that, in my view, simply took no account of what had happened historically. But these were normal people. We were inhabiting the same universe. The idea of intimidating students on a campus and denying them access because they were branded as Zionists, was essentially another word for identified Jew, was beyond the ken. It didn't exist. Okay, and I was also had amongst my friends pretty militant Black Power advocates who were not friendly on Israel. Again, we inhabited the same universe. We had occasional alliances, occasional disagreements. We inhabited the same domain on a campus. We went through university together. We're friends. When I see what's going on now, I'm very sorry. This reminds me of when Nazi students prevented Jewish students from entering campuses at the University of Vienna because they would pollute the campus. Okay, when in my neighborhood, where I grew up in Toronto, which was a Jewish neighborhood, my wife recently showed me a social media clip of what was going on in an area. If it wasn't that area, it was very close to it. I recognized a street there of these guys with their kafiot and they're yelling their slogans in front of people's houses, in front of their houses, in large numbers. What they were yelling were actually racist slogans. We will kill Zionists. We will destroy Zionists. We want Zionist blood. Next to them, in a large line, were Toronto's finest, from Metropolitan Toronto Police on bikes, doing absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. They were standing there and observing it. In a previous demonstration, they were handing coffee out to these people.
So maybe maybe the problem was precisely that you and we went for dinner with these guys after we had the discussion. Maybe we didn't understand the menace of some of those totalitarian arguments and politics. Maybe the liberal culture of the university has allowed all of these ideas to appear legitimate and reasonable, and we have gone for dinner afterwards. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do agree that the changes started in the 60s in the sense that the basis for left-wing politics switched from working class politics to anti-colonialist or national liberation movements. They were still very much within the domain of the secular. They were still within the domain of rational discussion. There wasn't the idea that you were going to obliterate an entire group of people. I remember having heated arguments about Israel. They did not suggest wiping Israel off the map. They wanted it reconstituted, as they called it. There wasn't an idea of mass slaughter or expulsion. I had extensive discussions with PLO people. These were not friendly, but they certainly were of a different sort than the kinds of discussions going on now. The sorts of slogans that are happening now simply would not have been accepted as within the domain of the rational, of the acceptable, even on what then passed as the far left, which I was intimately familiar with. So I think more has changed than we want to understand or accept. I think there's been a genuine social transformation, and we are living in a different kind of world. And it's necessary to see how radically the crisis has changed the way people perceive each other. And Jews in particular, the role we have been assigned. By the way, Jews, then the argument was, oh, your problem is you're allowed yourself to become Israel, an American client state. You need to integrate into the Middle East. That was the argument. I said, yeah, I'll go along with that. That's fine. That's not what we're hearing now. I'm sorry. It's a different story. The role of Jews Jews, whoever thought of attacking the community in the diaspora? It simply wasn't on the agenda. It really wasn't. Not in North America. Yes, in the Soviet Union. Yes, I agree with you. Soviet anti-Semitism is the antecedent for this, and it supplied a lot of the conceptual framework, but it wasn't imported into discussions in that time. And I think now it's gone well beyond it.
Okay. I would be happy to monopolize you for many hours, but we are not German intellectuals.
Thank heavens for that.
We do have a question online, but I'd also be happy to take a question in the room. I've got a mic that I can take around. So should I start with the room? Yeah, I'll hand over the mic to you, Sarah.
Just briefly, when you were talking about there was a lack in history, a lack of general call for emancipation of the Jews in various societies, where would you put the emancipation of the Jews in the wake of the French Revolution, or more specifically Napoleon?
Very, very good. Thank you for that. I have a discussion of it in the book. I mean, in the radical Republican, I'm not an expert on French history, so I'm kind of out of my depth here. But from what I understand, the radical French Republicans were actually quite disconcerted by Jews. And there's a famous speech by de Tonnerre, Count de Tonnerre, who on the Jewish question, which was given to the Revolutionary Assembly on the proper role of Jews in a post-revolutionary society, where essentially, I mean, it's a very extreme version of to the Jews as a people, nothing, to the Jews as individuals, everything, which meant, but it was put in far more extreme terms, as the Jews have to basically give up their cultural and religious institutions and fully integrate into France as a Republican society, meaning basically stop being Jewish. And so that stream of republicanism never disappeared, and it's actually quite clear in the far right. Certain elements of the far right are as well as in the far left. This basic idea that the Jews are a foreign body and they'll be acceptable only to the extent that they cease being Jews. Now that's made explicit in the German context by people like Bruno Bauer, who was a left Hegelian. And there's a long discussion of this, is that there's the idea that I think it's wrong to say that he opposed Jewish emancipation. For him, Jewish emancipation meant that Jews had to stop being Jews, then they could be fully accepted into. And his argument with Marx is a really interesting one, because Marx is seen as the advocate of Jewish emancipation. He said, no, actually what Marx was saying is, look, within the context of a bourgeois state, which is what you have in mind, you have to give the same rights to everybody. So if you give them to Christians, you have to give them to Jews. Jews were the only major minority then. But in fact, your state won't liberate anyone because it'll sustain private property and capitalism. So in a revolutionary society, and he hadn't yet written Capital and developed this notion of a classless post-revolutionary society, Jews wouldn't exist. I mean, he makes that explicit. In fact, he does it quite crudely by saying, capitalism will cease existing when Jews stop existing. What he really meant by that is Jews will be liberated from their role, their class role, and hence their culture will disappear. There was absolutely no concept of any legitimacy to Jewish life. Not their language, they had a language, they were speaking Yiddish. There were other Jewish languages in other parts of the diaspora, as well as Hebrew, which was always our national. None of this was legitimate. So the cause of Jewish emancipation, both for the French Republicans, but also for their German counterparts. And in Austria, it's also clear, even that Austro-Marxists, there's a discussion there of Otto Bauer, this multicultural idea of a cultural autonomy in a federative socialist. He basically wanted the Austro-Hungarian Empire without the Kaiser. There would be a kind of democratic socialist utopia. All the peoples would have culture, but not the Jews. Now, why not the Jews? He said, well, in the East, it's true they become a nation, but they are a deformed nation. They are deformed because they were, although there's a working class there, particularly in places like Poland and Russia, they're not a real nation. So they will disappear when the revolution happens. And similarly, in the East, in the West, sorry, they're no longer a nation anyway. And when religion disappears, they'll go. Now, what's interesting is he was in no sense a self-hater. So Otto Bauer would not give up his membership in the Jewish community and married in the main center, the main Jewish synagogue in Vienna, in part because you couldn't have a civil marriage, but also out of print. But he saw no basis for Jewish life. So the idea of emancipation of the Jews as a people who would then be integrated as a people into, whether it be Europe or in the Middle East, was never part of the left-wing agenda. Anti-Semitism was an epiphenomenon, which would disappear when Jews disappear, which would, in the benign case of the envisioned by the left, would be through simply natural process of attrition. In the case of the right, the Jews would disappear either by expulsion or annihilation. So I think it's very important to see that.
Let's take a few questions
Sure,
and comments or whatever.
Sure. So some questions online. One was, should Jews see October the 7th as a wake-up call, and if so, what should that lead to? What action should that lead to? Another question is about Trump in America. I'm not sure I'm fully interpreting this question correctly, but it seems to be asking that about a perception that some Jews are sort of supportive of Trump. Whatever we think of that, is that not a negative thing given the threat from the far right? So there's a couple of questions there. And then, do you want to ask your question as well, sir?
Yeah, well, I think one thing we can probably all agree on is that the current vocabulary of populism left, right, isn't really adequate to explaining what's happening now. We probably need to develop a new vocabulary. We obviously can't do that here and now. But it seems to me that in relation to populism, if you take populism to mean somehow deriving authority or sovereignty from the people, it seems to me that Islamism and what you've called left populism are profoundly anti-populist. It's not saying I'm not supporting them, but if you take the core belief of Islamism, for example, it's that sovereignty comes from God. There is no room for human beings in sovereignty. So in that sense, it seems to me to be anti-populist, and also it's anti-national. I mean, it might be anti-global, but its goal is an international Islamic order. So it's also anti-national. And similarly, if you take, very briefly, if you take the kind of woke left, if you want to use that terminology, I don't particularly like it very much, but it sees the mass of the population as deplorable. It doesn't kind of identify with the mass of the population. It sees itself as, we are the enlightened people who understand colonialism and imperialism and all the rest of it, and is also very hostile to the nation state, which is why if you take Momentum of Britain, for example, very pro-European Union, why they talk about open borders. So it seems to be better to talk, it seems to be better to talk about them as being anti-populist than populist.
So the question about the wake-up call, 7th of October, and you've spoken about 7th of October. Really, what was unique about the 7th of October? What was so new and so different? And is it a wake-up call?
Wake-up call is a rather odd term to use in this context. And if October 7th was a wake-up call, well, I hate to see what comes out.
Don't design that alarm clock. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Are we woke now? I think what October said, there are a number, I haven't fully digested October 7th. I have a hybrid identity. I'm Canadian and Israeli, and my family was in Israel, children, grandchildren, etc. So it was a terrible shock. Part of the shock was the idea that such a large event of a murder could occur in Israel, where we had always thought of ourselves as defended by the army, and that casualties were generally military or they were the result of single acts of terrorism. So this kind of invasion of space has produced trauma, and that's from an Israeli perspective. But I think it also undermined the idea of Israel as a safe haven for Jews, which is upsetting. At the same time, it unleashed a reaction that I think nobody could possibly anticipate. So the day after the attack, You have the unappetizing phenomena or spectacle of the Democratic Socialists of America, which I now call the National Socialists of America, celebrating the attack as an act of resistance and anti-colonial, of decolonization. Presumably then, they would have said similar things about what the Nazis did, because the Nazis were also anti-Western. And determined to undo the foundations of bourgeois oppression. So it's unclear to me. I mean, what followed then, the demonstrations, the outpouring of hate, the the monomaniacal obsession with Israel to the exclusion of any other conflict going on, even when the casualties are much higher, and very often in the same area, whether it be the Assad Russian and Hezbollah Iranian murder of Syrians, or whether it be the dismemberment of Lebanon by Hezbollah, or whether it be the genocidal attack in Darfur, which continues to this day. Everyone, including so-called reputable NGOs, even focusing exclusively on Israel, and everything that Israel did was by definition evil. I'm not a fan of the Israeli government, and I'm a veteran of the Israeli peace movement and the Israeli left, but what's going on is nothing to do with a criticism of the government or of the conduct of the war. It's simply deliberate defamation of a country for purposes of attacking it as the collective expression of the Jewish people. It's very simple. You might not like that. You might want to get into discussions about what Zionism. Fact is that close to, excuse me, close to half the population, the Jewish population of the world. Close to, 47% of the Jewish population lives in Israel. So the idea that, thank you. The idea that somehow one can talk about these people as Zionists, safely urge the destruction of an ideology without killing off at least half of people is, of course, fantasy. And the people who talk in this way know very well what they're saying. The idea that they're naive or that they're simply radical idealists is absurd. They're radical idealists the way the brown shirts were radical idealists. And I think it's necessary to see it as a kind of new Nazism, because what they're calling for is genocide. And one can be very critical of the way Israel conducted the war, and of the high level of Palestinian casualties, and deeply sympathetic to the Palestinian suffering. But what is going on, there is genocide, and it's unfortunately the plan for genocide is coming from the other side, and not to admit it is to commit an act of bad faith. It's classic gaslighting that goes with anti-Semitism over many generations and centuries. What shocked me was the rapidity and the uniformity of the reaction, that it happens everywhere. It's not just one or two countries, that it's more or less template driven. It's happening also in centers of liberal opinion, where people seem to have given up the capacity for critical thinking. So wake up call. I think it's coming to the surface, a kind of lava-type explosion of a volcano. However, if you look at the book, which, as I said, was completed well before October 7th, there is an anticipation, I think, of this kind of development. I just didn't expect it to go as fast and as deadly as it did. I just want to say one thing about populism. As I indicated to David, I don't use the term. I find it deceptive. And so I would agree with other criticisms. I don't analyze these movements in the book as populists. I use other terminology and other categories for trying to characterize them.
We had a question about Trump support.
Oh yes, Trump support. Okay, so both in the book, but also in an article which I recently published in Fathom, I talk about, how are we to deal with this? And I think that one of the options, which has always been tried out by Jews, is to join your enemy. Let's see what the other side offers, and that's a sort of long-standing traditional Jewish mistake. And we see it on the part of people who have so-called anti-Zionists who've joined the far left, and we see it on the part of right-wing Jews who feel that by joining Trump or Le Pen, or to the right of Le Pen, there's a French Jewish politician of Algerian background who I discuss in the book at length, and as well as various Jews who've decided that the Alternative für Deutschland is better than the far left. They make the mistake always of joining movements which are ultimately totally destructive of Jewish concerns and survival, and it's from a self-interest point of view absurd. It's a terrible thing to do. One of the things I do in the book is make reference to the attempt by Jews in Italy in the 1920s. There was a small group that joined the Italian Fascist Party on the assumption that, well, they were well enough integrated that they could become part of the national adventure. Unfortunately, in 1938, when Mussolini enacted his race laws, he didn't distinguish between members of the Fascist Party and members of the resistance. If they were Jewish, they received the same treatment they did as the Germans implemented. So this is a terrible mistake. It's tempting to want to endorse people who will bang over the head the obnoxious characters running down the street in Kafiyot yelling, "Kill the Zionists." What you have to realize is that these people are, from an electoral point of view, should they take power, actually very dangerous to us. They are not our friends. And I have a sub-chapter called Pro-Israel Antisemitism, because these people have a transactional support of Israel, people like Orban in Hungary. These are also guys who are pro-Russian, and thus part of we will find them in alliance with the Russian-Iranian axis. These are not our friends, and a certain amount of critical understanding of the political geography of what's going on is absolutely essential to our survival.
I think you meant Orban, not Corbyn.
I said Orban, didn't I? Corbyn is another one of our heroes, yes.
Let's take one more round of questions, contributions.
I'll take a question in
and
the
then
room.
a last word, and that will leave us time for people to buy Shalom's book and hopefully to get some beer.
Yes, I have a question online, but I'll take another one from the room if there is one. Okay, in that case, I'll ask the question online. So, oh, sorry, I didn't see. Oh, sorry, sir.
First of all, I must say I'm not much of a maven of the issues that we discuss here. But today in the afternoon, I read about Iranian.
Sorry, I'm not hearing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I introduced myself by saying that I'm not much of a maven of, although I had a couple of times the pleasure of discussing things with David. And this afternoon, I read a little bit about the history of Jews in Iran. And I was struck by the amount of anti-Semitism that existed in Iran in the Middle Ages. And if you allow me just for 1 minute to give the example which struck most in my mind, Jews were regarded as impure.
Yeah.
Impure to the point that Jews were not allowed to walk in the street when it was raining or snowing, because impurity would somehow wash off and touch Iranian Muslims.
But that's Shiite, it's not Sunni, but what you say is correct.
Shia.
What you say is correct, and I actually discussed it in the book. There was in fact an incident in the 19th century where an entire village in Iran was forced into the Jews were forced into conversion to avoid a mass slaughter, practiced crypto Jewish observance for 80 years until the Shah came to power. And then they left and returned to the, yes, Mashhad, exactly.
Yeah.
Actually, my Talmud teacher, who I've studied with for many years, here in London, his grandparents were there. And he had a direct personal experience with it.
I mean, I don't want to monopolize it, but the reason why I read it was because I have a friend who comes from Mashhad. He died when he was about 4 weeks ago, when he was 95 years old. And so I became more interested in the Mashhad experience. So I read a little bit more about that. I think that the conversion of the Iranians from Sunnis to Shia was in about the 16th century. The enormous anti-Semitism was already there during the Sunni time. It got worse during the Shia time. And it's different, I think, of the anti-Semitism in the Arab world, because I think the Iranian world was always more developed as a state than more as a state. You know, it was more of a state structure. But I was, and I have very much a feeling that some of the anti-Semitism that came out of Iran since the revolution is a rebirth of the anti-Semitism that existed there before. And it gives me very much a feeling, if I want to simplify the situation, and is that we're living in a time of an Islamic, particularly Shia Islamic, development towards fascism.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, it looks to me like I mean, it's important not to, if you look at again, it's a whole chapter on radical Islamism in the book, which I learned a lot from writing. The actual initial formulation of Islamism was Sunni, and it was at the end of the 19th century. It took place by Salafists from Lebanon and who moved to Egypt. And imported fairly classic, both Christian and secular anti-Jewish attitudes from Europe as a reaction to what they saw as the threat to Islam by Western ideas, particularly Arab nationalism and Turkish nationalism and liberalism and socialism. And this produced the Muslim Brotherhood, which was created by Hassan Banai, and then further articulated by Said Qutb. And these are the kind of standard works that provided the basis for Al-Qaeda and Hamas. These groups are simply direct outgrowths of those movements. Now, interestingly enough, the Palestinian nationalism is intimately embedded and intertwined with this. There were, of course, other elements in Palestinian nationalism, but the Mufti, the Grand Mufti, a position, by the way, created by the British, the governor Herbert Samuel in 21, was never existed before, and it's not a religious position; it's a political position. So Haj Amin Husseini was an Islamist. He was not a secular nationalist, and he opposed Nasser. And because he disapproved of the idea of nation states, he wanted a caliphate. He was inherited from Muslim Brotherhood writings this idea that the Jews represented a threat to the area independently of Zionism. But of course, he saw in Zionism the modern embodiment of the Crusades. This defined the leading edge of Palestinian nationalism in the pre-state era. And this is what Hamas comes directly out of, but it also infected even secular expressions of Palestinian nationalism. There were, of course, other elements, moderate elements. The Nashibi family, there were Palestinian labor leaders who wanted to cooperate with the left-wing elements of the Yishuv, talked about a binational state. Unfortunately, they were assassinated. But the Sunnis were not less substantial in, I'm talking about the Islamists, not the non-Islamists, in opposing both Arab nationalism and Middle Eastern nationalism in general, and in fomenting anti-Semitism. I mean, they were directly involved with the Nazis, as who they saw Germany as an anti-colonial weight against Britain and France. So I don't think it's only Iran that could be accused of infecting the Middle East with Islamism.
So
Mm.
It is, of course, the most effective.
Do we have another
We do have another question online about your idea that perhaps Jews are particularly vulnerable to the idea that the end is nigh, and what you make of this, sometimes the linking of climate change protests to anti-Semitism, or at least this kind of extreme anti-Enlightenment idea, or the idea of oil exploitation in Israel, etc.
Could you give me the question once more?
So just the question of what you think about the trends within the climate change protests in the context of Jews being particularly vulnerable to the idea that the end is nigh, this kind of eschatological thinking.
No, it's a good question. I think it's a nice insight. And why should Greta Thunberg care about Gaza rather than, I don't know, the Ukrainian war if she's a climate activist? I mean, in terms of pollution, I would have think the Russians do a better job than the Israelis, particularly given the nuclear facility of Chernobyl. Yes, I do think that's an interesting connection. What I do argue in the book is that anti-Semitism is at root an eschatological view of Jews as the demonic presence which prevents the emergence of a utopia, and that the conflict has, even in its most secular form, is at root a religious idea, and that's why it's intractable. And that's why we find ourselves in the focus in a way that no other conflict is. It's not a conflict. What I argue in the book at length is that the only way to solve the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is to naturalize it, to put it back in its perspective as an actual historical process in which two national movements are in conflict over the same territory, justice on both sides. Interestingly enough, the comparisons where the analogies are strongest are in the area. For example, Cyprus, between Turkish Muslims and Greek Christians, the whole interaction or dialectic between binationalism and partition. The Turkish population, by the way, is not indigenous. It was introduced by the Ottomans in the beginning of the 16th century, when they first conquered it from the Italians. The Greeks were native there for 3 millennia, yet they're clearly an integral constituent there. Since the war, big power conflict that has taken place with the Turks taking over, the Turks have imported settlers to over 50% of North Turkey, of the Cypriot Republic of the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus, consist of people imported from Anatolia after 74. Yet somehow or other, there's no left-wing group or anti-colonialist group sees this as a sort of expression of demonic evil, comparable to the attitudes that attach to us. By the way, the number of refugees is proportionally very large, particularly of Greek refugees who were expelled from their homes and can't go back. Where I live in North London is full of these people. Their view is very different than the ones that are expressed in the streets of Trafalgar Square of how to deal with the conflict. So this is the problem. This is exactly the problem. We are dealing with metaphysics. We're not dealing with a rational discussion, and this is why it is an intractable conflict, and we cannot allow it. It is a symptom of a social and economic dysfunction that it has become the central issue of our day.
Should we allow one more, or shall we go
very quickly?
If it could be very quick. Yes.
No, really, just an illustrative example of the eschatological approach. There was a poster at a demonstration in London which said, "The only place Jews are indigenous is hell."
Oh, nice. Shalom, I will give you the last word in a sec. I will take just one moment to defend some of our really close Iranian friends and colleagues and comrades even. I have an Iranian student who assures me that in the countryside in Iran, people who remember the collaboration between Israeli and Iranian agricultural technicians, if something works really well in Iran, they still say this works like an Israeli tractor. And of course, people are struggling and fighting for their liberation and for women's self-liberation and all over Iran. And some extraordinary examples of Iranians standing up against anti-Semitism too. But Shalom, your book's great. I hope people buy it. And thank you for this event tonight, which was great. And I will give you the last word.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, just one point. I strongly agree with what you said about Iran. I mean, some of the most heroic opponents of the Hamas demonstrators have been individual Iranian dissidents, as well as those who come out in force to support us. And we get support from them that we don't get, unfortunately, from our English colleagues, or our Canadian colleagues or American colleagues. So yes, and this is a very deeply civilized country that opposes its regime and has suffered terribly. So I didn't in any way mean to suggest otherwise. Let me thank all of you for coming and for asking excellent questions. My editor is here, Ian Malcolm. I would be remiss if I didn't thank him for the wonderful support he's given me both professionally and personally from Polity Press, and also to my family who's here and forced that I had to pack the room somehow. And I'm deeply grateful for all of you putting up with while I was writing the book, and I hope that it's of some use to you while we negotiate and navigate these very difficult waters that we're cast in now.
Right, well, on behalf of the library, thank you. So everyone in the room, please do take the opportunity to purchase your copy of Shalom's book, which is available for sale. And at home, you can buy it online. Thank you very much.
How much is it, Toby?
$17.50, I think.
Great.